Connecticut and Massachusetts, Z&M Homes buys houses. Sell your property to the local guys.
Needs repairs, updates, maybe foreclosure or inherited? No problem. We gotcha. Google or add us on Facebook at ZANDMHomes.com.
It's Baxy's Musical Podcast. Resistance is useless.
In 1974, guitarist Richard Lloyd and his band's manager Terry Ork approached the owner of a dumpy little biker bar at 315 Bowery in New York City. At the time, the owner of the bar was hanging a large banner over the front door, a bar that he was hoping would only feature country and bluegrass music. That's it. He was not planning on having the place being overtaken by rock bands, nor was he planning on the place becoming an iconic hub for one of the most dynamic cultural movements in music history. The name of the club was CBGB's, and on that day, Richard Lloyd and Terry Ork convinced the owner, Hilly Crystal, to let their band Television play on a Sunday night. The band, which not only featured Lloyd, also featured Tom Verlaine on guitar and Richard Hell on bass, and would become not only the club's very first rock band to play at CBGB's, it would be Television that first lit the fuse on what would become the New York City punk scene. Now, I'm just going to come right out and say this. Of all the bands that came out of CBGB's over the next couple of years, the Ramones, early Talking Heads, Blondie, the Patti Smith Group, it would be Television that would release what is perhaps the best and most enduring record of the bunch. Yes, the first couple of albums by the Ramones were great. Yeah, the first couple of albums by Talking Heads were pretty good too. But compared to Television's 1977 debut album, Marquee Moon, it's not even a fair fight. Let me take it another step for you. Marquee Moon isn't just the strongest punk album to come out of New York in 1977. It's one of the greatest guitar albums ever released, and it would not be an exaggeration to say that Marquee Moon was punk's first masterpiece. The funny thing is that listening to the record 44 years later, it hardly feels like a punk album at all. In fact, calling it a punk album ignores the intricacies and beauty of this album completely. If the whole idea around punk was that anyone could do it regardless of their ability, then Television were the exact opposite of that. Marquee Moon is a timelessly breathtaking record that should be essential to anyone who has ever bought records or for anyone who has ever bothered to try playing guitar. It's an essential record that has never been out of print and has been included in nearly every list of the greatest albums of all time. The interplay between Tom Verlaine and Richard Lloyd on guitar to this day has been largely unmatched. I think what I'm trying to tell you is Television was pretty good. Since the band broke up, Richard Lloyd has released a number of excellent solo albums, including 1979's Alchemy and Field of Fire in 1986. He's collaborated with John Doe of X, Rocket from a Tomb, featuring Cheetah Chrome from the Dead Boys and David Thomas from Pierre Ubu, Chris Stamey from the DBs, and Matthew Sweet. In 2019, Richard Lloyd wrote a tremendous memoir entitled Everything is Combustible, Television, CBGB's, and 5 Decades of Rock and Roll. It's an amazing book that looks at Richard's life both in and out of television, finding himself in the company of the likes of Jimi Hendrix, Keith Richards, Keith Moon, and many, many others. It also chronicles his journey in and out of addiction problems, and of course, he also talks at length about the late Tom Verlaine. Richard Lloyd and his band are on tour this month. In fact, they'll be at the Parlor Room in Northampton on Saturday, September 16th. This is my conversation with the legendary Richard Lloyd from Television on Baxy's Musical Podcast. I just finished reading your book, Everything is Combustible. In fact, it's one of the very few biographies I actually read twice because I want to make sure I got everything correct, and I loved it. But the more compelling stories are actually the stories apart from all that. Before you guys record a single note, like one of the things I wanted to ask you about, which I thought was a really interesting part of your story, is about Velvet Turner and how essential and important he was to you in your career. Tell me a little bit about him and what he meant to you, not just musically, but personally.
I was at a friend of mine's house after school, Zeke Berman, and he got a phone. We were waiting on some drugs, and he thought it might be we thought it might be the dealer, but it wasn't. It was this guy. He got off the phone, and he was like, "Oh no, there's this kid, he claims to know Jimi Hendrix, and he's coming over. And 10 minutes later, he was there, rang the bell, and was let in, and the door opened, and I saw this, scrawny black kid. And in any case, the moment I laid eyes on him, I knew in my intuition that he did know Hendrix. And in the meantime, everybody else that was there had taken a kind of a little pact that they were going to laugh at him and make him so-called prove it and not believe him. But I believed him.
What do you think it was that convinced you? I mean, tuition aside, what was it that allowed you?
I don't know. I have pretty good intuition, and it was just pretty clear to me that he was not lying, that everybody else was lying. He was not lying.
And it was true. In fact, he knew Jimi Hendrix and was kind of a protege in a way of
That's
Jimi.
right. He was one of Jimmy's own. He was Jimmy's only guitar student. I mean, that Jimmy sat him down with the guitar and actually taught him.
And then to have him teach you the things that he had learned from Jimi Hendrix. I mean,
well, I don't know if it was him teaching me, but he would come over to my house and show me the stuff Jimmy was showing him, and then we would both try to mimic it. So that's how that came about.
In the book, when you talk about your own guitar playing, there's a whole series about, especially early on, about you being very self-conscious about it and maybe even insecure to play in front of people, which isn't unusual for a lot of people who are starting out or just learning in their own room. But something had to change for you in order to start playing in front of actual crowds and people. And
well, I got invited to go on stage with John Lee Hooker one night in Boston at the Jazz Workshop where John Lee was playing. And I was backstage because there was no security there. You could just go, and I pulled up a chair and I sat in it. And he was talking to somebody, and then he turned to me and he said, "And you, young man, what's your name?" I said, "Richard." He says, "Richie, what you do?" I said, "Well, I play guitar." And he said, "Well, you're going to sit in with the band tonight then?" And I was like, "Oh, no." He goes, No. I'm going to turn the lights on and search for you. I'm going to have people come and find you. And you're coming up on stage." So it was kind of that. That forced me in front of people. And it was very painful for me to sit in with him. And I was like, barely a baby on the guitar at the time.
So to be on stage with a guy like that, I mean, how did it occur to you that, hey, maybe I could actually do more of this? Or did you still feel that?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
But it wasn't that I would be able to do more of it, but that my time would come. It was clear that I was not in that particular age group or, I must have been 16. And so I was not prepared. And in fact, television's the first band I was ever in. I wasn't in a band. I was just biding my time, waiting for the right moment.
And when I was reading that in the book, I was just thinking, like, if that had been me, I'd be looking around the room saying, "What am I doing here? How did I get so lucky?" I mean, just to have that experience with John Lee Hooker is amazing.
Yeah, sure was.
Yeah. So when you talk about television, and we'll talk more in depth about it, there's like a whole introductory period of you meeting Richard Hell and then going to see Tom Verlaine for the very first time and seeing him on stage and being convinced that this is the guy that you want to play with. Again, I assume that intuition has a big part of it, much like your friendship with Velvet Turner. But what was it that you saw in him that made you convinced that this is the guy you wanted to start a band with?
Well, he was quirky, that's for sure, and had insecurity, but he also had security in what he was doing and a very poetic frame of mind. But his playing was really, how can I put it? spare. I mean, he was just supporting himself on on electric guitar, but playing cowboy chords,
Right.
not bar chords, way at the bottom of the fretboard. And there were so many, I don't want to call them holes, but I can't think of another word. There was like places in his performance that were missing, or that I knew that I could fill in, and make what he had stronger. And he could do the same for me, vice versa. Because I knew in my heart of hearts that I was not at that time able to lead a band. And Tom was.
So
And he had no band. In fact, they had a failed attempt at a band, and they had put out advertisements in the Neon Boys for a second guitarist with the notion, talent not necessary. And I had a lot of talent, but I guess it wasn't necessary. I had something else. And Tom came by, and we traded guitars back and forth, and that's when we both said, "Yeah, let's give it a go."
I think when people listen to television, they listen to Marquee Moon, and they hear that, how well you guys play off each other, which doesn't happen very often in a lot of bands. It's not like, one's playing rhythm and one's playing lead. You guys are like interchangeably creating.
That's not entirely true, because the way it worked was whenever Tom is singing, I am playing the lead or the melodic support. The only time I switched to pure rhythm guitar is when he took a solo. All the other times he was playing rhythm and I was playing the melody lines or the lead. And I told him right off the bat, I'm a lead guitar player. I'm not a rhythm guitar player. And that's the way it turned out.
So by the time you actually do start playing with him, did he also see, or did he ever really intimate this to you, that he also saw where you fit into the puzzle?
We didn't talk like that. So I clearly it was as clear as rain, but I don't know how indelible a mark that made on him. I have no idea. I just know it happened.
I know in a lot of different collaborations, it really is all about chemistry, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the two of you are best of friends moving forward. But there's something.
Yeah, bands that go on the road together and then they never socialize. That happens all the time.
Yeah, but clearly, especially the two of you, the other guys in the band as well, but particularly the two of you, there was this chemistry that it's you can't put your finger on what it was, but when you hear those two records, Marquee Moon and Adventure, it's like it's kind of hard to deny that there was something special going on between the two of you, even if it was never actually articulated that way.
Yeah, if I don't listen to my own stuff hardly at all, but when I did and when I do, I only hear like one thing. I hear the song and all the parts. Musicians are different than non-musicians in that, I can't listen to music anymore because I'm paying attention to the reverbs and the amp placements and the mix. I'm listening to the snare drum is too loud or what have you, whatever it is. And most people will be like, which one's the drums?
Yeah, I would imagine when you get too close to something, you can almost be hypercritical of where things are, where things should be. Yeah,
absolutely.
When Tom died earlier this year, you wind up saying things and writing some things that were very kind to him, some very respectful things about him, and understandably so. But in the book, you kind of also describe him as a very complicated guy, and that the relationship between you as business partners and as individuals, was not an easy straight line.
No, he shot himself in the foot a lot, and by nature of our relationship, that meant I got shot in the foot, which is not pleasant. You know, I don't know how many times that he embarrassed me in front of record company people, etc., or in front of journalists or in front of fans for that matter. I mean, it was difficult. It was something I had to set aside in order to work with him because he wasn't going to change. Or if he did change, it wouldn't be on my behalf.
Well,
It'd have to come from something in it.
yeah, and there's the parts of the story in which you're about to sign a record deal, and he wants to sign as a solo artist and have the rest of television.
Well, we didn't know that at the time. I learned that post after the fact. But yes, that's what happened. Because Patti Smith had been signed by herself to Arista, and then the Patti Smith group were musicians that she kept on retainer or what have you. I mean, the Patti Smith band were not signed to Arista, period. So he wanted to deal commiserate with that, and they just simply said, we're not signing you. We're signing a band, and you're in the band. But if you want to get signed by yourself, we're not the record company for you.
When you do find this information out, I mean...
Yeah, it was far too late to do anything.
Right.
To get angry even. It was just sort of like wink, wink, nudge, nudge. That happened.
I have some experience, working with long-term partners, and I know that sometimes, the things you find out afterwards are like, well, that's kind of interesting. But, like you said, there's nothing you can do about it, but it's like it just kind of adds a piece to a story that you just wonder, well, why would he have done that?
Well, we can clearly see he didn't think of it as I'm joining a band as much as he thought he was the whole thing. And that's clearly not the case. All you got to do is listen to his solo records, which are like, he might as well have used drum machines, and probably did.
So I've done a lot of interviews with people who were around at the time, and I'm glad I got a chance to talk to you about this, about CBGB's. And I know that the story of that club is pretty infamous. You and Terry Orr convincing Hilly Crystal to play live rock music as far back as 1974. But what's so interesting to me is, here's a guy that didn't really want to bring this into his club. He does. And all of a sudden, you guys, wind up playing on Sunday nights. And next thing you know, this scene begins to grow that New York was sorely lacking. How quickly did that scene start to happen? Did it take a long period of time, or did it?
No.
Yeah.
No, within 6 months, there were like 6 solid bands that were around. Television, then Ramones, Talking Heads, Blondie. Those were the main bands. And then on the side, you had things like Mink DeVille, which was kind of like, rhythm and blues, but original too. The deal we made with Hilly was, basically it was a great deal for Hilly because Terry Ork did all the work. Basically he booked the club for the first 2 years, year and a half, and behind the scenes, it was really Terry's social experiment. He wanted to be like Warhol, who had, had a relationship with the Velvet Underground. And Terry very much wanted to do that, create a sociological scene. And, he needed a band, and we were the band.
You also, in doing this, turned what might have been maybe the biggest dump in New York into this legendary landmark. It's incredible that, if you've ever been there or look at pictures inside, you go, well, how did magic happen here?
Exactly.
But you also had spent, I know from the book and reading other things that you had also, prior to this, had spent a lot of time at Max's Kansas City, especially in the back room.
Sure.
I heard lots of stories about that experience from other people. What was your experience like at Max's? I mean, because it sounded like a pretty eclectic type of thing, from Warhol to everybody else, Lou Reed. It just sounds like a wide array of things going on in a very small space.
Yeah. Well, there were places that the musicians would hang out, and in Warhol's case, and the factory, Max's Kansas City was like that place. There were places like Steve Paul's The Scene and Ungano's, which prior to that had been places where musicians from out of town would hang out, English musicians. But CBGB's was a place where, it was Lower East Side, and you could be from New York, and play there. In fact, we didn't have anybody playing covers. That was like the antithesis of what we wanted in a club.
As it's been described to me, as I understand this, all of these things are happening at once at CBGB's. There wasn't really much of a scene to speak of at the time that this was starting to turn. But I
don't know. It was its own scene.
Yeah. But it sounds like New York prior to this. There was the Mercer, for a while, but prior to this,
that fell down, didn't it?
Right, that fell down. But it sounded like prior to this, there wasn't really a growing scene of music happening in New York at that time, and it just seemed like it was like a perfect storm of incidents that happened, and starting with the Mercer, collapsing on itself.
Exactly.
Tell me about that.
Well, I don't know, because I was en route from Los Angeles, where I had been living for 2.5 years, back to New York, basically because I had heard about the possibility of a scene developing, and the place was the Mercer Art Center. We stopped in New Orleans on our way across the country. And while I was there, the Mercer Art Center had fallen down. So the scene that I was hoping to find in New York had collapsed on my way there. So I don't know that much about Mercer Art Center's scene, because it had disappeared by the time I got back to New York. People were doing gigs in like the Hotel Diplomat, in the ballroom of the Hotel Diplomat. I used to go there and see weird acts, like the Dolls.
Remind me if I'm getting this right. On days that you were not playing, you were still there pretty regularly, hanging out or watching other bands.
Open for me, it was an open bar, and it was a party, and it was like New Year's Eve for 3 years.
Were there particular bands that seemed to stand out for you? I mean, obviously, Television was a pretty important band there, but there were other bands going in and out of there. Were there any particular favorites of yours?
Oh, I loved the Ramones even before they ever played CBGB's. I saw them at the Performance Workshop on 20th Street. Talking Heads were good. We did a lot of shows with them. And then there were others, not as good musically, like Blondie, who weren't very good in the beginning, but turned out to be the biggest one, in terms of sales of any of us. And Patti Smith, who came in later, after we were filling the place anyway.
One of the things that I think is so kind of interesting, so Television gets lumped into this whole categorization as being a punk band. And, I think anyone who's ever listened to Television or know anything about them, when I listen to those records, they're just great rock and roll records. I mean, there's very little punk that I hear in that. I hear something almost far more sophisticated than punk would become and had been at that time.
What do I know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, but you were in the middle of it. How do you see that? I mean, everyone needs to categorize
we were
something.
A band before the word punk became synonymous with this we were called New Wave. Journalists didn't know how to, they didn't know what to say. So when this, punk thing came along, everybody jumped on the bandwagon, because now they have a little word that they can put down and cover a lot of ground.
It just to me seemed to be kind of like like a lazy way of explaining what television was all about. I mean, the timing, suggested
Well,
that's what you were.
journalists are inherently lazy. I don't know how many times I've read stuff that's culled from earlier reportage.
Right.
People are too lazy to actually go and do it themselves.
In the book, you have some amazing stories about some people that you spent time with. There's some great stories about your friendship with Anita Pallenberg and spending time with Keith Richard.
Yeah.
That just, as I'm reading it, I just thought, first of all, just spend time with Keith. For most people, just you hope that Keith is exactly what you hope Keith is, and it sounds like that's exactly who Keith is, exactly what you expect him to be.
Yeah, there's no secretiveness in him. He's open.
But he also seems like genuinely a pretty warm person in his more.
Oh, very warm. I love the guy. He's considering what he has to put up with, and I've had a taste of it, like barely. But when you're up against that kind of visibility, you can't do anything without it being big notice. He kept remarkable composure.
Well, I think when you reach the level of that kind of success, and you've been doing it for 60 years or so, there has to be a certain acceptance of the fact that he can't ever stop being Keith Richard. He's Keith Richard 24 hours a day.
Yeah, you become a kind of caricature of yourself.
Exactly. Which
can't help it.
Yeah. And also in the book, you talk about you and Keith Moon, and another guy who is somewhat of a caricature of himself, but didn't have the lasting.
But none of us were trying to do that. That's the interesting thing. Those were people who were all very much themselves. Nobody wrote the rules. Nobody followed the rules. So everybody was their own character. I know that Anita had told Keith that I was in this band Television and the Television were going to be huge, which at the time was as promising as anything else, that would be true.
Right.
In fact, John Lennon saw us at Club 82, said we reminded him of the Beatles in Hamburg, energy-wise. So, these were like older brothers. We weren't exactly peers, but we were certainly in the game.
You also talk very openly in the book. I found this part to be pretty powerful. You talk about your addiction issues in the past, alcohol, heroin, nearly anything else you could get your hands on. But you also talk about
but
you also talk about the process of battling those addictions and how sick you had become. There's so much, there's so many people struggling with opioid addiction now. When you look at what's going on now with drug culture or anything, how do you relate to that? Does it seem larger to you? What is your thought about it today?
It's moved into the Bridge and Tunnel Club, Bridge and Tunnel crowd, we called them. They weren't from Manhattan,
right?
From Long Island. Everybody's into it now, and it's very sad because they don't know what they're getting into. At least those who are. The funny thing is, and this is a good example of it in the Johnny Thunders realm. I'm not saying Johnny did it, but you look at somebody like Keith Richards and you say he does tons of drugs, he writes songs, and he's famous and wealthy. But you don't realize the first thing he did was play. The second thing he did was write the songs. Third thing he did was take some drugs so he could continue to do it. And the fourth thing, he gets wealthy on top of everything else. But so what happens is people look at that, or they look at Guns N' Roses and something, they say, well, then I'm going to do the drugs and that'll help me write the songs, and then I'll get discovered and I'll be famous and I'll get wealthy. And that's like ass backwards.
Another thing I want to ask you about, and I think it's a really cool thing, because I've actually interviewed both Cheetah Chrome and Craig Bell from
Rocket from the Tomb.
Rocket from the Tomb, which I think is like one of the most amazing things that I've ever heard of, a band that had all these great songs. They were a great band. They break up, and it splits into two things: the Dead Boys and Pierre Ubu. And then when they came back in 2003, the late Peter Lofner couldn't participate, so they asked you. And I think that's amazing. Yeah, my interview with Craig Bell was awesome, and it was
that's great. He's a great guy.
He's a wonderful guy. But to go back with those guys in a band that could have been so huge, and then to produce the album that they did wind up recording, that had to be a really cool experience.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, Cheetah wrote me an email saying he was doing some RFTT thing and would I like to participate. And I had no idea what RFTT meant. I didn't know it was Rocket from the Tombs, but I said yes because I knew that Cheetah and I could be a team, two guitar players who are significantly different from one another and would make an interesting grouping. So I said yes, without knowing what the hell I was getting myself into. And then it turned out to be the band that opened for us in Cleveland. The first time we left town to go play a show in Cleveland, they were the opening act.
It's an amazing story.
What
of
goes
that band.
around comes around.
Absolutely true. I know I don't have you for a whole lot of time. I know that you and your current band are coming to Northampton, Massachusetts on September 16th. Tell me a little bit about that tour and what people can expect when they see you.
Well, I'm playing it as a trio and doing some television songs and my own songs and a cover or two. And it's that simple. It's rock and roll.
That'd be great.
What it was in the beginning.
Richard, I really appreciate the time that you had to spend. Like I said, I know you're kind of pressed on time, but and I want to thank you for that.
Oh, thank you, Michael. Good luck with your show.
Thank you.
I look forward maybe to meeting you.
I appreciate that. Good to talk to you, Richard.
Right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Richard Lloyd and his band are going to be at the Parlor Room in Northampton, Massachusetts on Saturday, September 16th. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, feel free to like it, share it, tell all your friends about it. You can find regular updates about the show on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, and you can also email me at bax@rock102.com. Thanks again to Z&M Home Buyers for their support, and thanks to you for listening to Baxy's Musical Podcast.